They said my grandmother died poor. That was the story. The one my father told me when I was 7. The one my stepmother repeated at his funeral 22 days before I stood at the edge of a trapdoor I did not know existed. In a garden shed, on a mountain in Oregon, with a flashlight shaking in my hand, and my little sister asleep in a house I had walked into for the first time 48 hours earlier. I was 18 years old. My father was 3 weeks in the ground. My 6-year-old sister was upstairs in a bed that smelled like cedar and lavender, in pajamas that were not hers, in a house that was not ours, because the woman who called herself our stepmother had put us out into the rain the night after the will was read. Because the will was a lie. Because my father had hidden a brass key in the back of his desk drawer with a folded note. Because the note said in his handwriting that if I was reading it, something had happened to him. And I should take my sister. And I should go to my grandmother Adelaide. On Blackwood Mountain, end of Ridgeline Road, because she had been waiting for me a long time. But I had grown up believing my grandmother was dead. For 18 years. He had lied to me for 18 years. And now I was standing in her cellar, and what my flashlight was touching. On shelves that should not have existed. In a room that should not have been climate-controlled. Beneath a shed that should have been full of nothing but rust and old oil. Was 2 decades of a woman's silent work. For me, for a granddaughter she had never met. Who had never known she existed. My name is Nora Ashcroft, and this is the story of the 4 weeks that broke my life open. And the woman who had been building a place inside that break for 18 years, waiting for me to fall through. My father died on a Tuesday in February. His name was David Ashcroft. He was 52, an engineer at a small firm in the suburbs of Portland, the kind of man who packed his lunch in the same brown paper bag for 11 years. Who wore the same wool coat every winter, who bought a new pair of work boots every 3 years, exactly on the anniversary of his last pair. He collapsed in the parking lot outside his office building. Heart attack. Massive. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the pavement. They said it kindly, as if the word massive could be softened by a gentle voice, as if 52 years of a life could be summarized by a single medical adjective. I was studying for a biology midterm at the community college. I got the call at 2:47 p.m. I do not remember the drive to the hospital. I remember Wren, my 6-year-old sister, sitting on a plastic chair in the waiting room, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, her feet swinging back and forth, like a metronome counting the seconds of a life that had already ended. She looked up at me. She said one word. She said, "Daddy," and I could not answer her, because if I opened my mouth, the sound that came out would not be a word. It would be something older, something without language. My stepmother arrived 20 minutes after I did. Her name was Vivian. She had been married to my father for 9 years. She had walked into our lives when I was 10 at a company Christmas party my father had brought me to. She had said hello to me the way people say hello to a piece of furniture they are considering buying. I remember her that first day, in her cream sweater, in her careful smile, in the way she had touched my father's arm, as if she already owned it. I was 10. I did not understand what I was seeing. I do understand now. She arrived at the hospital in black. Tailored, complete, as if she had been dressing for it. As if she had known the phone call was coming and had prepared her wardrobe accordingly. She cried. She cried loudly, publicly, in the way that draws every eye in the room, in the way that requires tissues to be handed to her by strangers. I watched her. I did not cry, not because I did not feel it, but because grief in me had gone somewhere quiet, somewhere it could sit, somewhere it could wait to be dealt with alone. I had learned that from my father. Grief was private. Grief was for after everyone had gone home. The funeral was on a Saturday, at a small stone church downtown that my father had rarely attended. The pews were half full. My father had not been famous. He had not been rich. He had been quiet and kind and reliable. The kind of man whose absence would be felt slowly. In small ways, over years. Vivian delivered the eulogy. She talked about him, as if she had known him her entire life. She talked about the man she had married, about the years they had shared, about the daughters they had raised together. Daughters, plural, as if I had been hers. As if she had ever, in 9 years, spoken to me the way a mother speaks to a daughter. I stood in the front pew, and I held Wren's small hand, and I let Vivian tell a story that was not true, because it was not the time to correct her. Because grief has an order of operations, and I did not yet know what I would soon know. 3 days after the funeral, Vivian called me into the kitchen. She was making coffee, yoga pants, ponytail, no trace of the woman who had cried at the church 3 days before. She turned to face me. She said, "Nora, we need to talk about the will." I sat down at the table, because that is what you do. When someone says we need to talk, you sit down, you wait. She slid a document across the table. A single sheet of paper, notarized, dated 4 months before my father's death. She said, "Your father updated his will in October." I read the document. I read it twice, because it made no sense. Because it said everything went to Vivian. The house, the savings account, the car, the life insurance, everything my father had built in 52 years. I looked up at her. I said, "This isn't right." She said, "It's what he wanted, Nora." I said, "He never mentioned this to me." She said, "He never mentioned a lot of things to you." Something in the way she said it, something in the calm, something in the small satisfied edge in her voice. That was the moment I understood. She had been waiting for this. Not grieving. Waiting. She let us stay for 3 more days. I used the word let deliberately. On the 3rd night she came into my room. She said, "I need you and Wren to be gone by morning." I stared at her. I said, "Wren is your daughter." She said, "Wren is a burden I can't carry alone right now. You're 18. You're an adult. Take her." I said, "You can't just." She said, "I can. And I am." I said, "Where are we supposed to go?" She smiled. That was the worst part. She smiled. She said, "Figure it out." And she closed the door. I stayed up all night packing. 1 duffel bag for me. 1 small suitcase for Wren. Her stuffed rabbit. Her favorite pajamas. The photograph of her and Dad at the beach last summer. I packed what could not be replaced. I left everything else. 3 a.m. I went into my father's study. I was not looking for anything specific. I just wanted to be near him, one more time, before I lost the last place where he still lived. I sat in his chair. I put my hands on the wood. And I noticed something. The bottom drawer of his desk was slightly open. A 1/4 inch of shadow. My father was a meticulous man. He did not leave drawers open. I pulled it out. Inside were tax documents, old bank statements, folded map, and at the very back, tucked behind everything else, an envelope. Plain white, no name on the outside. I opened it. Inside was a small brass key, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with hands that had begun, without my permission, to shake. The handwriting was my father's. It said, "Nora, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. Take your sister. Go to your grandmother Adelaide. Blackwood Mountain. End of Ridgeline Road, outside a town called Millbrook, in the Cascade foothills. She has been waiting for you a long time. Trust her. Trust no one else. I love you both. Dad." I read it 3 times. I read it until the words stopped making sense, and then started making sense again. Because my grandmother Adelaide was dead. Because my father had told me when I was 7 years old that she had died before I was born. Because I had grown up believing I had no grandmother on my father's side. Because he had lied to me. For 18 years he had lied to me. I sat in his chair. The brass key sat in my palm like a small heavy heart. I did not know what to think. I did not know what to feel. I only knew that at 3:14 in the morning, in a house I was about to lose, holding a letter from a father I had just buried, I finally had somewhere to go. Somewhere that wasn't here. Somewhere someone might be waiting. We left at dawn. Vivian did not come outside. I had not expected her to. I loaded the bags into the back of Frank's blue pickup truck. Frank owned the auto shop where my father used to bring his car. When I called him at 5 a.m. and asked if I could borrow a vehicle, he did not ask why. He said, "Come get the blue one. Keys are on the visor." That is what small acts of grace look like. They do not announce themselves. They just appear. Wren climbed into the passenger seat with her rabbit. She was still half asleep. She had not asked where we were going. Maybe because she was 6. Maybe because she trusted me. Maybe because she had already learned, in the way children in unstable homes learn quickly, that asking too many questions does not help. I pulled out of the driveway of the only home I had ever known. I did not look back. The drive took 4 hours. The first 2 were highway, Interstate 5 North, then east into the foothills. The last 2 were something else. The road narrowed as we climbed. 2 lanes became 1. Pavement became gravel. The trees closed in on either side. Tall, dark Douglas firs that made the sky look like something borrowed. Wren woke around the 3rd hour. She said, "Where are we?" I said, "We're going to see your great-grandmother." She said, "I have a great-grandmother?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Why haven't we met her before?" And I did not have an answer, because the true answer was that I did not know, because our father had lied, because there were reasons I could not yet explain. I said, "I'll explain when we get there." She nodded. She accepted it. She went back to looking out the window, 6 years old, already learning to wait for answers that might never come. The last mile was the hardest. The gravel gave way to packed dirt. The dirt gave way to a track barely wide enough for the truck. Snow still lay in patches, the kind of stubborn March snow that refuses to leave until April drags it out. Then the trees thinned, and the house appeared, smaller than I had imagined. But then, I had not imagined anything. I had grown up believing this place did not exist. The roof was dark green metal, rusted along one edge. The porch was wooden, weathered gray, the kind of gray that only happens after decades of mountain weather, the kind that has earned itself. I stopped the truck at the edge of the clearing. I looked at the house. I looked at the garden beside it. And that was when I noticed the first thing that made no sense. The garden had been tended. Recently, the beds were edged. The soil was turned. Straw mulch had been laid carefully over whatever lay dormant beneath. Someone had been working here, within the last week maybe, but my grandmother had died 4 months ago. So who was tending the garden? I helped Wren out of the truck. She held my hand. We walked toward the porch. I took the brass key from my pocket. I fit it into the lock. I turned it. The door opened on the first try, as if it had been waiting. The smell hit me first, with smoke, dried herbs, something older beneath both. Something like the mountain itself had seeped into the plaster over a century and decided to stay. I stepped inside. Wren stepped in behind me. Her small hand tightened around mine. The main room was warm. Warm. That was the second thing that made no sense. Because nobody had lived here for 4 months. Because there was no fire in the stove. But it was warm the way a house is warm when someone has been in it recently. When someone has left the stove burning through the morning and only just walked out. I turned in a slow circle. I saw the wood stove in the corner. I saw the windows with their deep sills. I saw the heavy oak table in the center of the room. And I saw the shelves, floor to ceiling, 2 entire walls, crowded not with books but with jars. Hundreds of jars, amber and clear, and the dark green-black of preserved greens, labeled in a small careful handwriting that tilted slightly to the left. Tomatoes 2022. Apple butter 2021. Garlic in Oil 2023. Wild Plum Jam 2019. Bone Broth 2020. The dates went back further than seemed possible. Ren let go of my hand. She walked to the shelves. She reached up. She touched a jar. Then another. Then another. Reverently, the way children touch things they suspect are alive. She said, "Nora, look how many." I said, "I see them." She said, "Who made all of these?" I said, "My grandmother." She said, "Where is she?" I said, "She's gone, sweetheart." Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But she made all of this for us, right?" I turned to look at her. I said, "Yes, I think she did." I explored the rest of the house slowly. 2 small bedrooms, each with a narrow bed, each with a wool blanket folded neatly at the foot, each with a small table beside the bed holding a lamp and a book. The book on the table in the smaller bedroom was a children's book. Illustrated, well-worn. I picked it up. Inside the front cover, in the same tilted handwriting, from the jars someone had written, "For the little one who will come, whoever she is, I have kept this book safe." I closed the book. I set it back down. Something in my chest, that had been tight for weeks, began to loosen. A woman I had never met had kept a children's book for a great-granddaughter she had never known would exist. For years, just in case. The kitchen was small and efficient. Cast iron pans hung above the range in size order. Cutting boards worn smooth at their centers. Dried herbs bundled and hanging from the low ceiling beams. Lavender, rosemary, yarrow, and on the kitchen table, set exactly in the center, was an envelope. Plain, cream-colored, no name on the outside, just 4 words in the small tilted handwriting. "For when you come." I stood looking at it. Not for, not if, for when. I picked up the envelope. I held it in my hand for a long time. I did not open it yet. I set it back down. I would open it tonight, after Ren was asleep. When I was ready, I made us dinner from what was in the pantry. Flour, oil, jars of preserved tomatoes, jars of white beans, a small ceramic crock of butter packed in salt. I made a simple soup. Ren sat at the oak table. She said, "It smells like grandmother's." I stopped stirring. I said, "How do you know what grandmothers smell like?" She said, "I don't know. It just does." 6 years old. Speaking truths I could not argue with. I put her to bed in the smaller bedroom. She said, "Nora?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart." She said, "Don't go far." I said, "I won't." She said, "Promise." I said, "I promise." She closed her eyes. She was asleep in under a minute. That was one of the ways I knew how tired she was. How long she had been holding herself upright for me. I sat at the oak table alone. The wood stove crackled quietly. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. 3 pages of the same small tilted handwriting. "Nora, I don't know when you will read this. I don't know what has brought you to this door. But I have prepared for the possibility that when you come, it will not be a happy circumstance. So I will not waste your time with pleasantries. My name is Adelaide Ashcroft. I am your father's mother. I have been alive your entire life, though I know he told you otherwise. I forgave him for that lie a long time ago. He had reasons that seemed good to him. I hope you can forgive him too, though I know that will be harder, because you are just learning of it now. Your grandfather died when your father was 5 years old. I had $43 in the bank and a house that needed a new roof. People said I was in a sorry situation. They said it kindly. They still said it. I made a decision that winter. I decided I would build the slowest safety net I had ever heard of. Not for me. I was already past the age of being saved by safety nets. For whoever came after. For whoever needed it. When your mother Sarah died of cancer in 2007, I began to build it in earnest. You were 1 year old. I had never met you, but I began to prepare for you. I stopped reading. I set the letter down. I put my hand over my mouth, because I was not going to cry. Because if I started crying, I would not stop. My grandmother had been alive for my entire life. She had known about me. She had known when my mother died. She had begun preparing for me when I was 1 year old. 18 years. I sat at the oak table and looked at the flames, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 3 weeks, the fact that I had been loved by people I had never known to look for. I read the rest of the letter that night. I read about a cellar beneath the garden shed. I read about seeds and jars and crates. I read the sentence, "If you have come to this house, you will need what I have left. Read Silas Hartwell's blue binder before you decide anything." I read the sentence, "Talk to Pastor Owen Bramwell at the Blackwood Community Chapel in Millbrook. He has been keeping something for you. He knows to give it to you when you ask." I read the sentence, "Vivian is not what she appears to be. Your father knew. He tried to protect you. If she has done what I fear she has done, do not confront her alone. There are documents. There are witnesses." That last part made me set the letter down. Because how had my grandmother known? Because how had a woman, who had been dead for 4 months, predicted what my stepmother would do 3 weeks after my father's funeral? I woke at 7 a.m. to boots on the porch. I sat up fast. For one horrible moment I thought it was Vivian. I thought she had followed us. Then I heard the boots pause, considerate, waiting. Then a knock, careful, not loud. The knock of someone who knew there might be a sleeping child inside. I pulled on jeans. I opened the door. An old man stood on the porch. 72, maybe 73. Weathered face. Gray beard trimmed short. Worn wool cap. A pair of dark blue eyes that were startlingly calm. He said, "You're Nora." I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Silas Hartwell. Your grandmother was my closest friend for 41 years. I said, "She told me about you." He said, "She told me about you too, for a long time." I stepped aside. I said, "Come in." He walked into the house the way you walk into a place you have walked into many times before. He hung his cap on the hook. He unlaced his boots. He set them neatly beside the mat. He looked around the room. His eyes stopped on the letter still sitting open on the table. He said, "So, you've read it?" I said, "Some of it." He said, "Did she tell you about the cellar?" I said, "She mentioned it." He said, "Then it's time." I checked on Wren before we went out. She was still asleep, rabbit tucked under her chin. I followed Silas out into the yard. The garden shed sat at the north edge of the property. Low, solid, built against a stone wall that had been laid by hand before anyone alive today had been born. He opened the door. He walked to the workbench in the center of the shed. He set his hands against the front edge. He pushed. The workbench rolled on heavy casters that had been deliberately fitted for exactly this purpose. Beneath where the workbench had been was a wooden trapdoor, set flush into the shed floor. A simple iron ring for a handle. Silas looked at me. He said, "She spent nearly 2 decades on this. She started before you were born. She kept going even after your father stopped coming." He handed me a flashlight from a shelf. He said, "You'll want to go alone the first time." He said, "Because whatever you feel down there, you should feel it without an audience." I turned the flashlight on. I set my foot on the first rung of the ladder. The wood was smooth, worn smooth by hands that had descended and ascended this ladder hundreds of times over 18 years. I started to climb down. The flashlight beam swung in a slow arc as I descended. And what it illuminated, when it reached the bottom of the ladder, was not a dusty void. It was a room, an immaculate, climate-controlled, meticulously organized room. The beam swept across walls lined with shelves floor to ceiling. Every shelf was full. Jars, boxes, sealed packets wrapped in wax paper. Wooden crates numbered 1 through 6. I turned in a slow circle. I turned again. I could not take it all in. There was too much. My grandmother had spent 18 years building this. Alone. in the dark. For a granddaughter she had never met. I stood in the middle of that room with the flashlight in my hand. And I finally understood what my father had meant when he wrote, "She has been waiting for you a long time." He had not meant a few weeks. He had not meant a few years. He had meant my entire life. I felt something break open in my chest. Not grief, something older, something that felt, absurdly, like coming home to a place I had never been. I stood in my grandmother's cellar, and for the first time since my father died, I let myself cry. I climbed out of the cellar an hour later. My eyes were red. My knees were dusty. Silas Hartwell was sitting on the workbench, exactly where I had left him, waiting, patient, as if he had done this before with someone else, as if he had been prepared to wait as long as it took. He looked at me. He said, "You all right?" I said, "No." He said, "That's the right answer." He handed me a thermos of coffee. He said, "Come inside. I'll tell you what I can." We sat at the oak table. Ren was still asleep, or maybe pretending. 6-year-olds have a way of knowing when adults need to talk. Silas wrapped both hands around his mug. He said, "Your grandmother started planning in 2000. But she started the serious accumulation in 2007. I said, "The year my mother died." He said, "The year your mother died." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because that's when she knew." I said, "Knew what?" He looked at me. He said, "That your father was raising you alone, that he was scared, that he was 30 years old with a 1-year-old daughter and no wife, and that he had cut off contact with his mother years before that. She knew he wouldn't come back to her, but she also knew that someday, maybe, you might." I stared at him. I said, "My father cut off contact with her?" Silas nodded slowly. He said, "There was a fight when your father was 21, about something small, about something that never should have grown into what it grew into, but it did, and he left, and he didn't come back for a long time." I said, "How long?" He said, "He came back once, when you were 2 years old. He drove you up here for one afternoon." I said, "I don't remember that." He said, "You wouldn't. You were 2. I said, "Why didn't he come back after that?" Silas set his mug down. He said, "That's the part one can't fully explain. I have suspicions. Your grandmother had suspicions. But the answer, if there is one, is not mine to give." I said, "Then whose is it?" He said, "You'll get to it. She left the pieces in order. You have to find them the way she intended." I asked him about the garden. I said, "Someone has been tending it." He said, "Me." I said, "Since she died." He said, "Since a year before she died. Her hands got bad the last 2 years. Arthritis. She'd tell me what to do. I'd do it. She had very specific ideas." I said, "Did she know she was dying?" He said, "She was 81, Nora. Everyone that age knows they're dying. Some just make peace with it earlier." I said, "When did she plant the garlic?" He said, "November. Same as always. She didn't want the sequence to break." I said, "The sequence?" He said, "Winter garlic goes in the ground in November, comes up in April. She'd been doing it every year for 38 years. She wasn't going to stop just because she suspected she might not be here to see it come up." I looked out the kitchen window at the garden. I said, "She planted garlic for a spring she knew she wouldn't see." He said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Because she believed you'd come. And she wanted the garden to be ready when you did." Silas left around noon. He said he'd come back tomorrow. He said, "You should go see Pastor Owen tomorrow. In Millbrook." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because your grandmother said so." I said, "That's not really an answer." He said, "No, but it's the one she gave me, and I've learned to trust her instructions even when I don't understand them." He put his cap back on. He walked out the door. I watched him disappear down the path, through the trees. I made lunch for Wren. She ate at the oak table, watching me the way she watched everything now, carefully, cataloging. She said, "Are we staying?" I said, "For a while." She said, "How long is a while?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Okay." She kept eating. She said, "The lady who made the jars, did she love us?" I stopped what I was doing. I turned to look at her. I said, "Why do you ask that?" She said, "Because, all the jars." I said, "Yes, sweetheart. She loved us." She said, "Even me?" She didn't know me. I said, "Especially you." She thought about that. She nodded slowly. She went back to her soup. I stood at the counter and pressed my hand against my mouth so I would not make a sound. That afternoon I found the blue binder, second shelf in the cellar, exactly where the letter had said. I brought it up to the kitchen. I sat at the oak table with a fresh cup of coffee. I opened it. 46 pages. Silas's handwriting on every page. My grandmother's small tilted script in the margins. Corrections. Additions. Small arguments carried across the page for years. The binder was a manual for how to live on this mountain, how to plant, how to preserve, which soil in which bed, which season for which crop, how to seal wax, how to save seeds, which heritage varieties Adelaide had been cultivating for decades. I read for 2 hours. I understood maybe a tenth of it, but I understood the shape of it. This binder was not a hobbyist's notebook. This binder was a life's work. An 81-year-old woman had translated everything she knew into a language she could leave behind. For me, I drove down the mountain the next morning. Wren came with me. The town at the base of Blackwood Mountain was called Millbrook. Population 1,847. 1 traffic light, 2 gas stations, a diner called Ruth's, a hardware store, a post office. The church sat on a corner lot on Elm Street. White clapboard, a single steeple, a hand-painted sign that read Blackwood Community Chapel, and beneath it, established 1889. I parked the pickup. I took Wren's hand. We walked up the stone steps. The door was unlocked. Inside, the church smelled like old wood and candle wax, and the particular kind of dust that only accumulates in buildings that have been holding still for over a century. A man was sitting in the front pew. He turned when he heard the door. He was in his late 60s, silver hair, a face that had spent a lot of time listening to other people's grief, hands that trembled slightly. He stood up. He said, "You must be Nora." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "I've been waiting for you for 18 years. I said, "That seems to be a theme." He almost smiled. He said, "Your grandmother was thorough." His name was Owen Bramwell, pastor at Blackwood Community Chapel for 31 years. He said, "She didn't come to services often. The mountain road was too much for her, especially in winter. But she came twice a year. Every single year for 31 years. I said, "Twice a year?" He said, "Once in spring, once in fall. She'd bring me honey. She'd sit for coffee. She'd never ask for anything for herself." He paused. He said, "But she'd always ask one thing. Every visit. Without fail." I said, "What?" He said, "She'd ask if I'd heard anything about her granddaughter." I sat down. I had to. My legs stopped working. I said, "For 18 years?" He said, "For 18 years." I said, "And what would you tell her?" He said, "I never had anything to tell her, but she'd still ask." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because hope is a discipline, Nora. She practiced it every 6 months, whether it seemed reasonable or not." He took me to the back office. He unlocked a safe. Inside was a single envelope, manila, sealed with old wax, my grandmother's handwriting on the front. For Nora, only to be opened when she asks. I said, How did you know I would ask? He said. She told me you would. She said it might take a while. She said I should be patient. He handed the envelope to me. He said, she left this here in October of 2008. She was 65 years old. You were too. I took it. My hands were shaking. He said, don't open it here. Open it at the house. She was specific about that. Ren tugged on my sleeve. She said, Nora. I said, yes. She said, the pastor's hands are shaking. Owen looked down at his hands. He said, they do that now, sweetheart. Old age. She said, my daddy's hands used to shake. Owen went very still. He said, did they? She said, when he was reading me stories, right at the end. Before. She didn't finish. Owen crouched down. He said, what was his favorite story to read you? She thought about it. She said, the one about the rabbit who couldn't find his way home, but then the moon showed him. Owen swallowed. He said, that's a good one. She said, do you think Daddy is home now? Owen looked at her for a long moment. He said, I think home is a very particular thing, sweetheart, and I think your daddy is exactly where he's supposed to be. She nodded. She reached out and took his trembling hand in both of hers. She said, your hands can be shaky. Mine will hold them for a minute. Owen closed his eyes. I saw him blink hard. Then he blinked again. He held her small hands in his old ones for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Sometimes children can pray without knowing they're doing it. Sometimes their hands are the prayer. Owen walked us to the truck. Before I got in, he said, there's something else. I said, okay. He said, there's a woman in town you should meet. Her name is Meredith Cole. She was your grandmother's closest friend, from when they were girls together. She has something for you too. I said, how much did my grandmother leave for me? He said, everything, Nora. She left you everything. She just did it in pieces, spread out, in places you'd have to search for, in hands you'd have to trust. I said, why? He said, because she believed that things found are held more tightly than things given. We drove to Meredith Cole's house that afternoon. She lived in a small blue cottage on the edge of Millbrook. Roses climbing the porch railing. A cat asleep in the window. She opened the door before I knocked. She was 78. Silver braid down her back. Reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Eyes exactly like the ones I had seen in every jar label. She looked at me. Her eyes filled. She said, oh, honey, you look just like her. I said, like my grandmother? She said, yes. I said, nobody ever told me that. She said, nobody ever met her, sweetheart. That's why. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee. She fed Ren a cookie the size of a saucer. Then she went into her back room and brought out a wooden box. Small, rectangular. She set it in front of me. She said, your grandmother gave this to me in 2018. Told me to hold on to it. Told me to give it to you if you ever came looking. I opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I picked up the top letter. It was addressed to my father, to our old house, the address I had grown up at. I turned the envelope over, stamped across the front, in red ink, returned to sender. No such address. I said, that's not right. Meredith said, no. I said, that was our address, my whole life. Meredith said, I know. I picked up the next letter. Same envelope, same address, same red stamp. The next one, same. The next, same. I counted. There were 47 letters, written over 8 years. Every single one returned. I looked up at Meredith. I said, someone was intercepting them. She said, yes. I said, someone was calling the post office. She said, that would be my guess. I said, who? She looked at me. She waited. She let me arrive at the answer, because it was the only answer that made sense. I said, Vivian. Meredith nodded slowly. She said, Vivian. I opened one of the letters. Just one. Dated August of 2017. My father had married Vivian in the spring of 2016. My grandmother had written, David, I hope this finds you well. I hope Nora is well. I heard about the new baby from someone in town who saw a birth announcement. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I am your mother, and Nora is my granddaughter, and there is a new baby I have never seen. I am not asking for anything. I am only asking that you keep this letter. Not for you. For Nora. If a day comes when she needs to know that I existed, that I loved her, please give her this letter. I will keep writing, because I want there to be a record, because I want her to know someday that she was not forgotten. I love you, son. Whatever you believe about me now. I loved you when you were 5 and I love you now. Mom. I set the letter down. I did not cry. I had moved into a colder country than crying. I said, she wrote him 47 letters. Meredith said, that we know of. I said, he never saw any of them. Meredith said, no. I said, he came here when I was 2. He came for one afternoon. Then he stopped. Meredith said, yes. I said, why? She looked at me. She said, Nora, sweetheart, I have a theory. I don't know if it's true, but I have a theory. I said, tell me. She said, I think Vivian met your father before your mother died. I stopped breathing for a moment. I said, what? She said, I think she met him at his office in 2005 or 2006. Your mother was already sick by then. Ovarian cancer. It moves fast. Vivian worked as a contractor with your father's firm that year. I know because your father mentioned it in one of the last conversations he had with his mother, in 2007, when he called to tell her Sarah had died. I said, that doesn't. She said, it does. If you think about it. Vivian disappeared after Sarah's funeral. She reappeared in your father's life almost 10 years later. Married him within a year. Had a baby with him within 2. I said, you mean she waited? Meredith said, I think she waited. I said, 10 years. Meredith said, some people are patient in the wrong direction. I sat with that. I sat with the shape of it. The mirror image of my grandmother. Adelaide had waited 18 years to give. Vivian had waited 10 years to take. Both women had believed in patience. Only one of them had used it for love. I drove back up the mountain in silence. Wren fell asleep in the passenger seat. The wooden box of letters sat between us. I thought about my mother, Sarah, who had died when I was 1, who I did not remember, who my father had rarely spoken about. I thought about her differently now. I thought about the timing. I thought about how a woman named Vivian had appeared in my father's professional life a year before my mother died, and how she had disappeared, and how she had reappeared 10 years later, as if she had been waiting for grief to soften him. I thought about how my father had known. I thought about how he had married her anyway. Maybe he had needed help with a young child. Maybe he had been lonely. Maybe he had convinced himself she was different now. Maybe he had been wrong. And by the time he understood, there was a second daughter and a shared house and years and my grandmother's returned letters that he did not know about because Vivian had intercepted them. I got home. I put Wren to bed. I opened the manila envelope Pastor Owen had given me. Inside were 3 items. The first was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, dated October 2008. The second was a smaller sealed envelope, labeled, "Only after you have read everything else." The third was a bank statement. I looked at the bank statement. I looked at it again. It was an investment account. Established 2012. Current balance. Sufficient. Sufficient meant Wren would grow up in a house. Sufficient meant I could go to college. Sufficient meant I would never again sleep on a fold-out cot in a shelter. Sufficient meant my grandmother had signed a conservation easement on this land in 2012, which had paid her a sum of money, which she had invested, slowly, quietly, over 12 years. The way she grew garlic, the way she preserved tomatoes. She had grown money for me the same way she had grown food for me. Patient, compounding, silent. I read the letter from October 2008. Nora, you are 2 years old. I saw you last week. Your father brought you here for an afternoon. He would not stay the night. He would not eat the meal I had made. He held you tight and would not let me hold you for more than a moment. But I saw you. You have your grandfather's eyes. Your father told me before he left that he was not going to come back. He said the things he said in anger years ago cannot be unsaid. He said Sarah is gone, and his mother is not welcome in his home. He said he had come only because he wanted me to see you once so I would know what I was missing, and then he was going to close the door forever. I did not argue with him. There is no arguing with grief. There is only outlasting it. So I have decided. I will build for you, not for him, not to reconcile with him, not to prove anything to him. For you, for the person you will become, for the day which may or may not come, when you need somewhere to go. If you are reading this, that day has come. I am sorry it has. I am not sorry that I prepared for it. The bank account is yours. The land is yours. The house is yours. There is more. There will be more revealed as you go. Trust Silas. Trust Owen. Trust Meredith. Do not trust anyone else without asking one of them first. And Nora, if you have a sister, take care of her. You are the only person in the world who will love her the way I would have. I love you, Adelaide. I set the letter down. I did not open the smaller sealed envelope. Not yet. Because there is such a thing as too much revelation in one day. For days past, Silas came every morning. He taught me how to bank the wood stove for the night. He taught me how to check the water lines under the house for freezing. He taught me the names of the birds that came to the feeder at dawn. Wren followed him around the garden. She asked questions. He answered them the way he had answered mine. Slowly, honestly, she said, "Mr. Silas, are you my great-grandfather now?" He stopped weeding. He looked at her. He said, "I don't know, sweetheart. Am I?" She thought about it. She said, "I think so, if nobody else is." He said, "Then I guess I am." She nodded. She said, "Okay." She went back to picking up the small stones she had decided were beautiful. Silas looked at me across the garden. His eyes were wet. He said quietly, "Your grandmother would have loved her." I said, "I know." On the fourth day, a black SUV came up the road. I heard the engine before I saw it. Silas was in the garden. He straightened up. He looked at me. He said, "Who is that?" I said, "I know who it is." Vivian got out. Wool coat, dark sunglasses, lipstick the color of an old wound. She smiled when she saw me. She said, "Nora, honey, there you are." I did not move. Silas did not move. Wren, who had been holding a handful of small stones, moved closer to me. She wrapped her fingers around my leg. Tight. Vivian took her sunglasses off. She said, "I have been looking for you for 2 weeks." I said, "You threw us out." She said, "I was grieving." I said things I didn't mean. I said, "You changed the locks." She said, "I was grieving." I said, "You produced a fraudulent will." She stopped, just for a heartbeat. Then she recovered. She said, "Your father wanted things a certain way. I was trying to honor that. I know you're hurt, sweetheart. I know you're confused. But I've come to bring Wren home." I said, "This is her home." Vivian looked at the house. She looked at Silas. She looked at the garden. Then she looked back at me. She said, "Nora, sweetheart, you cannot possibly raise a 6-year-old in the middle of nowhere. You are 18 years old." I said, "I know what I am." She said, "You're not her mother." I said, Neither are you. Vivian's face did not change. But something behind her face changed. She said, "You've been talking to people." I said, "I've been talking to family." She said, "Nora." She took a step toward me. Silas moved before I could. He stepped forward, between me and her, casually, but firmly. And Vivian, who did not know Silas, did not know that a man his age could be that steady, that still. She stopped. She said, "I'll be back, Nora." I said, "Don't be." She said, "This isn't over." I said, "It never was over. You just thought it was." She got back in the SUV. She drove away. We watched the taillights disappear down the road. Silas said, "She's going to come back with a lawyer." I said, "I know." He said, "You need to open the last envelope." I said, "I was going to wait." He said, "Don't wait." I opened the smaller sealed envelope that night. Inside were two things. The first was a document, the real will of my father, signed, dated, notarized, witnessed by Pastor Owen Bramwell, signed in the year 2019, 3 months after Ren was born. It read, in essence, everything to Nora, everything to Ren, guardianship of Ren to Nora in the event of my death. Vivian to receive nothing except the right to remain in the house for up to 6 months, while she made other arrangements. It was ironclad. It was witnessed. It was notarized. My father had known. My father had gone to a small church on the side of a mountain 3 months after his second daughter was born, and had signed a will disinheriting the woman he was married to, and had left that will in the safe of a pastor he had never once introduced to me. He had known what Vivian was. He had known and stayed anyway. For Ren. Maybe for me. The second thing in the envelope was a photograph. It was my mother, Sarah, standing in the garden. This garden. The one I had walked through this morning. She was pregnant. Very pregnant. She was holding hands with a woman I had never seen, but whose eyes I now recognized in every jar label. Adelaide. Adelaide was holding my mother's hand. My mother was laughing. On the back of the photograph, in my grandmother's small tilted handwriting, Sarah and me. 2 months before Nora was born. She promised to bring the baby back every summer. She said Nora would grow up knowing this mountain. She said she wanted a daughter who knew where she came from. She kept that promise for 1 year. Then she was gone. And your father never brought you back. But I remember her promise. And I have kept it for her. Because someone had to. I sat at the oak table, the photograph in one hand, the will in the other, the letters in the box between them, Ren asleep in the next room. And I understood, finally, the full shape of what my grandmother had done. She had not just built a safety net for me. She had kept a promise for a woman who had died before she could keep it herself. She had loved me on my mother's behalf. She had spent 18 years being both my grandmother and, in some quiet, impossible way, my mother. I put my face in my hands. I sat that way for a long time. I did not cry. I did not sleep. I just sat. And the mountain sat with me. And somewhere in the dark, I made a promise of my own. I was not going to let Vivian take this away. I was not going to lose Ren. I was not going to disappoint the woman who had waited 18 years for me to walk through her door. Whatever came next, I was ready. Vivian came back 4 days later. She did not come alone. She brought a lawyer in a gray suit, and a man from the county with a clipboard, and a look on her face I had seen before, the look of a woman who thought she had already won. I was in the garden when they arrived. Silas was with me. We were planting spinach starts, cold hardy, the kind Adelaide had bred for this hillside over 30 years. Ren was on the porch, reading the children's book. The SUV came up the road slowly, deliberately, as if Vivian wanted us to hear her coming. I stood up. I brushed dirt off my knees. Silas said, "You all right?" I said, "No." He said, "Good. That means you're paying attention." Vivian got out first. Different coat this time. Cream. Softer. A wardrobe adjustment. She smiled at me. She said, Nora. Sweetheart, I brought some people to help us work this out. I said, I don't need help. She said, well, that's why I brought them. The lawyer stepped forward. Michael Harrington, represented Mrs. Ashcroft. Here to serve documents. Would I please step over to the porch? So we could discuss things. In a civilized manner. I did not move. I said, serve them here. He said, ma'am, this is a delicate matter. I said, so is the fact that you're trespassing. Vivian's smile tightened. She said, Nora, don't be difficult. I said, I'm being clear. There's a difference. The county man cleared his throat. He said, Miss Ashcroft, I'm here regarding a welfare check. On the minor child. I said, Wren. He said, yes, ma'am. I said, who filed? He glanced at Vivian. He said, Mrs. Ashcroft, the stepmother. I said, legal guardian? He hesitated. He said, that's part of what's in dispute. I said, it isn't in dispute. I have a will. The lawyer stepped in fast. He said, the will you're referring to has been challenged. Mrs. Ashcroft has filed. I said, the will she produced is a forgery. The county man's eyebrows went up. Vivian said, Nora, that's a very serious accusation. I said, it's a serious crime. She said, you have no proof. I said, I have the real will. Signed, notarized, witnessed by an ordained minister, held in a church safe for 6 years. Silence. The lawyer opened his mouth. He closed it again, because he had not been told about that, because Vivian had not told him, because Vivian had assumed I would still be the 18-year-old girl who had walked out of the house 3 weeks ago with a duffel bag and no idea what to do next. She had assumed wrong. I said, please wait here. I walked into the house. I picked up a folder from the oak table. The folder contained everything. The certified copy of my father's real will. A copy of Adelaide's guardianship affidavit signed 6 months before her death. A letter from a lawyer in Millbrook named Harold Finch, who had reviewed the documents, who had agreed to represent me, because he had known my grandmother for 40 years. I walked back outside. I handed the folder to Michael Harrington. I said, read it here, on the porch. Take your time. He looked at me. He looked at Vivian. He looked at the folder. Then he sat down on the top step of the porch and opened it. I watched his face as he read. I watched him get to page 3. I watched him get to the notarized signature. I watched him get to the witness signature of Pastor Owen Bramwell. He closed the folder. He looked up at Vivian. He said quietly, Mrs. Ashcroft, we need to talk in the car. She said, Michael, this is... He said, in the car. They talked for 11 minutes. I timed it. When the lawyer got out of the car, his face was different. He walked over to me. He said, Miss Ashcroft, I'm withdrawing from this matter. I said, okay. He said, I was not fully informed of the circumstances. He got in his own car. He drove away. The county man walked over next. He said, Miss Ashcroft, based on what I've seen today, I don't have any concerns about the welfare of the minor child. I said, thank you. He said, I'll file my report accordingly. He drove away, which left Vivian, alone, in the SUV, trapped in the exact position she had put me in 3 weeks earlier. I walked to the driver's side window. I stood there. She did not roll it down at first. I waited. Eventually she rolled it down. She said, Nora. I said, you have one thing to say to me. Choose it carefully. She said, I'm your family. I said, that was the wrong thing. She started to cry. Not theatrical this time. Something smaller. But I had seen her cry at a funeral. I had seen her cry when it served her. I did not have room in me for her tears. She said, Nora, please, I don't have anywhere to go. I said, neither did we. For weeks ago. She said, I made mistakes. I said, you committed crimes. She said, please. I said, you have 6 months in the house. That's what my father's will allows. After that, you find somewhere else. She stared at me. She said, 6 months? You'd give me 6 months? I said, my father gave you 6 months. I'm honoring what he wrote. She said, why would he do that? After everything? I said, because he was a better person than either of us. She had no answer for that. She rolled the window up. She turned the SUV around. She drove down the mountain. I watched her taillights disappear one more time, and this time, I knew she would not come back. That night I called Harold Finch. I told him what had happened. He said, Nora, there's something else. I said, okay. He said, the forgery, that's a felony. Multiple felonies, fraud, forgery, attempted grand theft. I said, I know. He said, you have the right to press charges. I said, I know. He said, do you want to? I sat with the question. I thought about Vivian. I thought about my mother in the photograph. I thought about the 47 returned letters. I thought about Wren, 6 years old, who would grow up knowing exactly what her mother had done, if it went to court. I said, Harold, can we do it without Wren having to testify? He said, I think so. There's enough documentary evidence. I said, then yes, press charges. He said, are you sure? I said, I'm not doing it for revenge. He said, why then? I said, because she's going to do this to someone else if we don't stop her. He said, okay. He said, I'll handle it. The garlic came up on April 6th. Wren woke me at 6:14 in the morning by shaking my shoulder. She said, Nora, come see. I said, sweetheart, it's early. She said, come see. I got out of bed. I put on my coat over my pajamas. I followed her out to the porch. The morning light was pale and cold and gold at the edges. That specific promise of warmth still hours away. Wren pointed at the garden. She said, look. I looked. The garlic bed. The one Silas had planted in November. The one Adelaide had directed him to plant. From her sickbed. Green spears. Dozens of them. Small. Definite. Pushing up through the dark soil. Exactly where they had been placed 6 months ago. Exactly on time. I stood on the porch with my 6-year-old sister. And I watched the garlic come up. Wren said. She said it would. I said, who did? She said, the lady who made the jars. She left me a note. In the book. I said, what did the note say? Wren thought about it. She said, it said things you plant in November come up in April, even if you're gone. I looked down at her. I said, she wrote that to you? Wren said, she wrote it to whoever came. I put my hand on the top of her head. I said, that's you, sweetheart. She wrote it to you. Wren said, and you? I said, and me. That morning I climbed the hill behind the house. Alone. Silas had shown me the graves my second week. 2 granite stones in a small clearing at the top of the ridge. My grandfather Michael died 1962. My grandmother Adelaide died 2024. I brought one thing with me, a jar of apple butter, labeled in her handwriting, 6 years old, still perfectly sealed. I sat down beside her grave. I set the jar on the stone. I said, I found the cellar. Wind moved through the trees. I said, I found the will. I found the letters. I found the account. I found the photograph of my mother. I said, I met Owen. I met Meredith. I've been reading Silas's binder. I said, Wren likes it here. I said, I like it here. I said, Vivian is going to answer for what she did. I have made sure of that. I said, I don't know how to be who you thought I would be, but I'm going to try. I sat for a long time. The wind kept moving. The The sun climbed higher. I said, "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." I said, "I'm sorry I didn't know to come." I said, "But I'm here now." I got up. I left the jar on the stone. Because it belonged to her. Because she had made it with her own hands. Because I wanted her to know I had found it. Pastor Owen came to visit the following Sunday. He brought a small wooden box. He set it on the oak table. He said, "She left this for me to give you last. Not when you asked. When I decided you were ready." I said, "How did you know I was ready?" He said, "You didn't press charges out of anger. You pressed them out of duty. That's how I knew." I opened the box. Inside was Adelaide's wedding ring. Thin, gold, worn smooth by 60 years of hands, and a single sheet of paper, folded once. I opened it. Nora, if you are reading this, you have understood everything you need to understand. You have found the seller. You have found the will. You have found the letters. You have found the account. You have met the people who will help you. I want you to have my wedding ring, not because I need you to keep it, because I need you to have the choice of what to do with it. Sell it, wear it, bury it with me, give it to Ren someday, whatever feels right. What I want you to keep is this letter, because it says the one thing I could not say when I was alive, because when I was alive I was too proud, or too afraid. I want you to know that I was not a saint. I was a woman who had lost a husband, and a daughter-in-law and a son, who had spent 20 years alone, who had chosen work over grief because work was the only thing that kept her upright. Some nights I doubted. Some nights I sat in this kitchen and thought I had wasted my life, that the seller was foolish, that no one was ever coming, that I had built a museum to a granddaughter who would never walk through the door, and then I would keep going. Because the alternative was to stop, and I was afraid that if I stopped, I would find out the truth about what I had done, which was that I had loved a child I had never met for 18 years without any evidence that she would ever love me back. You do not owe me anything. You do not owe me a return. You do not owe me a memory. You do not owe me the trouble of visiting this grave. Live your life. Love your sister. Choose what to keep and what to leave behind. If you keep anything, from me, keep this. What looks like patience from the outside is often just faith with the volume turned down. Do not be ashamed of your quiet faith. Do not apologize for the slow things you build for people who may never see them. I love you, Nora. I loved you when you were 1 year old, and you sat on my porch and pulled my hair. I loved you when you were 2, and you came for an afternoon and could not remember me. I loved you at 18, when you were somewhere I could not reach. I love you now, whatever now is, wherever you are reading this. Adelaide. I read the letter twice. I folded it. I put it back in the box with the ring. I sat for a long time and did not do anything at all. Owen sat with me. He did not speak. Sometimes the ministry is a folded pair of hands in a kitchen, and the willingness to say nothing. Vivian pleaded guilty in June. Harold Finch had built the case with documents, the forged will, the bank records showing her transfers of my father's money, the pattern of intercepted mail, the affidavits from Meredith and Owen, the photograph of my mother and grandmother with a date that predated the entire fiction Vivian had constructed. She took the plea. For years. Out in 2 with good behavior. Barred from contacting me or Ren without violating probation. Harold called me after the sentencing. He said, "It's done." I said, "Thank you." He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "That's honest." I said, "I thought I'd feel better." He said, "You will. Not today, but eventually." I said, "Harold." He said, "Yes." I said, "Adelaide chose you, didn't she?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She hired me in 2010. Told me she might need my services someday. Told me not to bill her until the day came." I said, "She planned this." He said, "She planned the possibility of it. She hoped it would never come, but she planned for it." I said, How do you thank someone who is not there anymore? He said, you honor what they built. I said, that's it. He said, that's everything, Nora. I stayed on the mountain. I did not sell the house. I did not liquidate the account. I moved into Adelaide's bedroom. I put Ren in the smaller bedroom. I began, slowly, to inhabit the shape of a life my grandmother had left behind. I read the blue binder every night. I ask Silas questions every day. I made mistakes. I killed some seedlings. I ruined my first batch of jam. I planted tomatoes too early and they froze. And I sat in the garden and cried for an hour. And then I got up and I planted them again. Adelaide had made mistakes too. Her margin notes said so. Bed 3. Too much clay. Do not use for root crops. Failed. Frost got them. Try again with row cover. This variety does not do well here. Discontinue. She had failed and kept going. So did I. That summer I found something else in the attic. Silas had mentioned it in passing one afternoon, as if he had assumed I knew. He said, the trunk up there has her ornaments. And the quilt. I said, there's a quilt. He looked at me. He said, Nora, this house has been keeping secrets from you for 6 months. You haven't found half of what's in it yet. The trunk was cedar. Inside were ornaments, small carved wooden birds. Dried orange slices tied with red thread. Paper stars cut from grocery bags in the 70s. And beneath the ornaments, wrapped in tissue paper, was a quilt, full size, hand-stitched, made from squares of fabric. I lifted it out. I laid it across the attic floor. Ren climbed the ladder behind me. She said, what is it? I said, a quilt. She said, whose? I said, I don't know yet. Then I looked closer. The squares were not random. Each one was a piece of clothing. A child's dress, a man's work shirt, a woman's summer blouse. And in the corner, embroidered in that small tilted script, for Nora, started 2007, finished 2019, 12 years. She had spent 12 years making a quilt for me. I sat on the attic floor, with my hand on the fabric. I said, Ren, look at this square. She said, the blue one. I said, yes. I said, that's your grandmother's dress. The other one, Sarah, that's my mother's dress. She's wearing it in the photograph. Ren was quiet. Then she said, how did Adelaide get her dress? I said, I don't know. But I thought I did. I thought maybe Sarah had left it here, on that visit before I was born. Maybe she had promised to come back for it. Maybe Adelaide had kept it, the way she kept everything. I looked at the other squares. I found a piece of my father's flannel shirt. I found a piece of a baby blanket. Mine, I think. I found a piece of my grandfather's work shirt. The quilt was a record. The quilt was every person Adelaide had loved. Held in one piece, kept warm by the same thread. I brought the quilt down that night. I laid it on my bed. Ren climbed under it with me. She said, Nora. I said, yes. She said, do you think Daddy knew about the quilt? I said, I don't know, sweetheart. She said, so we have 4 mothers. I said, 4? She said, yours, mine, Adelaide, and you. I stopped breathing for a moment. I said, I'm not your mother, Ren. She said, yes, you are. It's okay. You don't have to call it that. But you are. I did not answer. I could not answer. I pulled her closer under the quilt. I felt her small back against my chest. I felt her breathing slow into sleep. I lay awake for a long time listening to the snow that had begun to fall outside, and to my sister breathing, and to the mountain holding us both. For mothers, she was right. Of course she was right. The first snow of the next winter came in early November. I was in the kitchen making bread. Ren was at the oak table doing her homework, a math worksheet. She was chewing on the end of her pencil in a way that made her look, for one blinding moment, exactly like our father. I stopped kneading. I stood at the counter with my hands in the dough. I watched her, the way she squinted at the paper, the way she tapped the pencil, the way she was, without knowing it, everything he had been, everything he had loved, everything he had left behind. She looked up. She caught me looking. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing, sweetheart. I love you." She said, "I love you too." She went back to her worksheet. I went back to the bread. Outside the window, the first flakes began to fall. I thought about Adelaide, standing at this counter, for 20 years, making bread, making jam, making rows of jars for a granddaughter she was not sure would ever come. I thought about her hands, aching with arthritis in her last years, still working, for when you come. I thought about the November she had planted the last garlic, knowing she would not see it come up, knowing it was her last November. She had planted it anyway, because faith is not about certainty. Faith is about planting things in November for a spring you may not see. That night I sat at the oak table alone. Wren was asleep. The bread was cooling on the rack. The wood stove was banked for the night. I took out a piece of paper. I took out a pen. I wrote, in my own handwriting, which had started, without my noticing, to slant slightly to the left, to whoever finds this. You may not know me. That is all right. You do not need to. This house has been kept for you, by people who came before you. You are welcome here. There is food in the cellar. There are blankets in the trunk at the foot of the bed. There is a garden that will be ready in April, no matter what month you arrive. Someone loved you before you got here. Do not apologize for arriving late. You arrived exactly on time. Nora Ashcroft. I folded the letter. I put it in an envelope. I wrote on the front, in the small tilted handwriting I had inherited, without asking for it, "For when you come." I set it on the shelf, beside a jar of apple butter from 2015, beside the children's book that had been waiting 16 years for a small pair of hands, beside the wooden box that held a wedding ring and a letter and a promise I had made on a hill in April. I turned out the light. I stood in the dark kitchen. I listened to the mountain. I listened to my sister breathing in the next room. I listened to the silence of a house that had been built by many hands for someone who might never come, and who had come anyway, and who was tonight home. I said, out loud, to the empty kitchen, and the falling snow, and the woman I had never met, but had come, finally, to know. "Thank you, Grandma. I'm here." The wood stove settled. The mountain held its silence, and the snow kept falling, kept falling, kept falling.